Okay, great. I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bullis. I'm the Senior Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, also known as Time Up. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our newest virtual panel, Getting Away with It, the Systems and Institutions Protecting Lebanon's Elite, that we at the Tahrir Institute are privileged to host today. As Lebanon marks 3 years this month since the devastating August 4th, 2020 Beirut Port explosion, the country's political elite are still far from being held to account. Not those complicit in the deadly blast, nor those who have stolen billions of dollars from the Lebanese people and drained banks and public institutions of their funds, nor those responsible for targeted violence to silence political opposition. For years now, ordinary people have organized and taken to the streets to voice their rejection of the status quo. Desperate depositors have pulled off bank heists for their own money, and international actors have made countless commitments to justice in Lebanon and condemnations of the ruling elite's crimes. Calls for reform to rectify these institutional failures have been met with fierce opposition by the country's ruling elite, with legislation and politicking consistently being used to shield them from any financial or legal consequences. Amid the institutionalized corruption and political paralysis that has come to characterize Lebanese political arena, there's been an increased tightening on freedom of expression, as evident in the activists being interrogated, the freedom-restricting amendments to the Lawyers' Code of Ethics, and assaults on journalists. So today's discussion will delve into the pervasive impunity of Lebanon's elite many years into multiple crises, the systems that obstruct accountability, and the necessity for judicial reform. Before we begin, I want to share a few quick reminders. As always, today's conversation is being recorded and will be shared widely after the panel. You can follow along with us in live tweet using the hashtag #TimeUpEvents. And we invite and encourage our audience to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function at any time. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Maya Jbeili. Maya is the Reuters bureau chief for Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you to Time Up for hosting this event. And thank you, of course, to everybody who has tuned in today. It is something that I think it's really important to check in on since we've had several developments on accountability in Lebanon and abroad over the course of the past couple of months. And I think today's panelists will give us a really great overview of what we have witnessed this year and where we're going, both in terms of opportunities and challenges. So before I get started with the speaker bios, just again, a few housekeeping items. Please do pop your questions in to the Q&A as soon as you think of them, so I can get a sense of how many questions there may be from the audience, or as appropriate, maybe even integrate them into the questions that I'll be asking our speakers as we go along. And to the speakers, I'm saying this in front of all the audience as well, to keep you accountable, keep your answers to 5 minutes per question or less, because that will give the opportunity to your fellow speakers also to jump in and add a little point. So if you do want to answer a question or add to an answer that one of your peers has responded to, just put your hand up and I can and I can add you on for a minute or so. And with that, I'd like to introduce our excellent speakers. Omar Talib is a Lebanese human rights lawyer and non-resident fellow at Time Up, who's focusing on impunity and access to justice in Lebanon at this crucial time. Lama Karame is a lawyer and researcher with a focus on public interest law and social justice. She's a board member at the Beirut-based NGO and research center, The Legal Agenda, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and is currently pursuing her PhD in socio-legal studies at the University of Oxford. Zaina Wakim is an international lawyer and currently the president of the board of the Swiss Foundation Accountability Now, which many of you have probably also heard of, which assists civil society in its quest for accountability in Lebanon, and most recently brought suit in a Texas court for harm faced by U.S. citizens as a result of the Beirut Port explosion. And last, but of course not least, Asad Dabyan is the executive director of the Gharbal Initiative, which is a research center and think tank that advocates for more transparency and e-governance in Lebanon. And you'll get to see hands-on some of the great work that they have been doing. So we're going to move through a quick round-robin set of questions. I'm going to start with Omar to lay the groundwork here with some insider knowledge. What are the fundamental and structural problems that have effectively made it so that Lebanon's judiciary cannot be independent? As kind of a general first question, and then more specifically, how did the economic crisis of the last almost 4 years now impact those structural problems?
Hello everyone. Thank you, Maya, for your introduction. The current judicial system allows the interference of the political authority in forming the highest judicial positions that have key influence on accountability. So looking for to the higher judicial council, it is formed of 10 members, which 8 of them are appointed by the political authority by a decree from the Council of Ministers, and including these 8 that are appointed by the political authority. There are also the highest positions as the head of the higher judicial council and the public prosecutor at the court of cassation. Historically, the political authority reserves the sensitive positions to judges that are satisfied with, and that they didn't threaten the regime. Going more in depth, like also the distribution of all judges in different courts in Lebanon is also done by a decree from the Council of Ministers. Also looking to very like sensitive positions, we should look to the positions of the public prosecutors and then investigative judges in different regions of Lebanon, because when talking about accountability, these judges are the ones that start any prosecution again in any crime. They are the frontliners. Giving an example about the investigative judge in Beirut in the prosecution of Najib Mikati, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, and in the case of the subsidized housing loans that was taken to his companies, a prosecution was started according to illicit enrichment law. It was the first time in the history of Lebanon this law is used, but this was a very positive thing. But looking how this prosecution ends, the investigative judge in Beirut dropped all the charges illegally. He made an order and dropped all the charges according to statute of limitation. But looking at the law that was amended in 2020 and also the previous law that was in 1999, there's no statute of limitation. This is an example about the sensitivity of these positions in the judiciary. Going more in depth, like looking for the position of the public prosecutor at the Court of Cassation, which is the head of the public prosecution in Lebanon, and he which is now Ghassan Awaidat, he instruct all the public prosecutors in Lebanon, and historically this position was in many times was the entrance of the interference of the political authority in the judiciary system, and because this position could hold all the public prosecutors in Lebanon. Finally, for this section of the question, a bill, an independence of the judiciary bill, was submitted to the parliament in 2018, and until which have many solutions for these issues, but until now it is in the parliament, going from one committee to another, and because the majority of the parliament is from this regime, and it is very clear that all political parties don't want this law to pass or to be enacted. Going to the second part of your question regarding the
In 1
economic
minute. In 1 minute, Omar, please. Thanks.
Okay. After 3 years and more of the economic crisis, for example, the workers in the courts, the judicial assistants, their salaries is deteriorated for more than 90%. They make about with all transportation and bonus, for example, about $80 to $100 per month. So many of them are not coming every day to courts. It is hard to know the schedule of every court regarding the judges and the workers. Regarding some logistics that are very simple, but people working in Lebanon and like judges and lawyers think about all the time. For example, the electricity, is there electricity in the justice palaces or not? Many times it is no. And in 25 July, there was a questioning for Riyad Salemi. It was postponed only because there's no electricity in the Justice Palace, in Beirut Justice Palace, and etc. This is the situation of there's many lack of resources, and there's suffering, really suffering in the courts and justice palaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Omar. Thanks. Sorry to cut you off, but that question in particular, I know that we can go on talking for a very, very long time about. And yeah, we know that many people tried to file complaints, tried to take certain actions, either against certain banks, against other figures in the political elite, and they couldn't do it because the judges were on strike because of their salaries. So it creates this kind of vicious cycle. But since we focused on kind of unfortunately one of the dual tragedies that Lebanon has lived in the past couple of years, I'll move on to the second one, which is the Beirut Port blast. Lama, August 4th and its aftermath really drove home, I think, for a lot of Lebanese who weren't aware of this before, but really drove home for them that Lebanon's problems could not be solved on a political level, economic level, on accountability more generally, of course, unless the deeply flawed judiciary was addressed. So that really became a focus for many Lebanese when it wasn't maybe something that the general population was aware of before. So here I want to ask about August 4th specifically. How have elites obstructed justice over the past year, specifically over the blast, especially since Judge Tariq Bitar tried to resume his investigation at the beginning of the year, which was a big moment that all of us were watching. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed. So how have they been obstructing justice in that sense? And do you see any avenues in the future where a real investigation can be revived in Lebanon?
Yeah, thank you, Maya, and thank you for Tahrir Institute for the invitation. Unfortunately, the impunity in the case of the Beirut blast isn't exceptional. It's part of a larger pattern that has characterized actually the post-war era in Lebanon, starting with the blanket amnesty law that absolved former warlords and allowed them to become state officials. However, what's really unprecedented in the case of this investigation is that it's one of the very rare times where we see a judge that is not supported by a political party actually stand up and confront this political class. And this is really a significant accomplishment on its own that we should not underestimate, although, as you said, the broader picture today is really grim. And in return of Tariq Bitar activism, if I can say, the political elite and more specifically suspects, including high-ranking officials, parliamentarians, ministers, have succeeded in impeding the investigation since December 2021. And they have deployed an arsenal of legal tools, which are really too complex to summarize in 5 minutes, but I'll try. So their first strategy was to refuse to appear to their scheduled questioning, often under the pretext of immunities, whether parliamentary, ministerial, or even the immunity of public officials. And when these arguments failed, they resorted to the next level of confrontation, which included filing repetitive cases and requests to remove Judge Tariq al-Bitar under the pretext of an alleged suspicion of his impartiality. And under Lebanese law, such requests automatically suspend the investigation until another court looks into the validity of these claims. So if the other court found that these claims are valid, the judge is removed and another judge is actually appointed. If not, the judge is allowed to resume the probe. So far, there has been more than 40 requests to remove Bitar, all of which have been rejected. But obviously, suspects did not stop here, and they only got more creative. The most recent strategy is that they lodged a complaint against Bitar in front of the plenary assembly at the Court of Cassation, which is the highest court in Lebanon. And this is really a malicious lawsuit because when they lodged the complaint, they knew that the judges of this court, the judges of the plenary assembly, were about to retire. So what they did is that they submitted the complaint, and this obviously led to the suspension of the investigation. And in parallel, they paralyzed the court. So the Minister of Finance, Yusuf Al-Khalil, who is a pro-Amal minister and who ironically was also one of the deputies of Riyad Saleh, refused to sign the decree to appoint the replacement judges at the plenary assembly at the Court of Cassation. So technically, legally, through the law, they suspended the investigation, and politically, they paralyzed an entire court and they stopped appointing judges in the court. And this has not only suspended the investigation into the port blast, but has also paralyzed the highest court in Lebanon, and it has paralyzed a number of high-profile cases, including regular cases for regular individuals who are seeking justice. Now, fast forward to what you mentioned, the attempt of Judge Bitar to resume the investigation. In January 2023, the Minister of Justice had overtly pressured the higher Judicial Council to appoint a replacement for Judge Bitar. And there were rumors circulating in the country that indeed, Judge Bitar might be removed. So faced with this impasse, Judge Bitar unexpectedly decided to resume the investigation. And he relied on a judicial precedent, according to which he can resume his investigation, despite the fact that there are requests to remove him. So he did rely on a legal text, on a legal precedent, regardless if we agree with that or not, but there is a legal basis for Bitar's decision. And his bold move was obviously considered, again, very provocative to the political elites. And as a reaction, General Prosecutor Ghassan Awaidat, who is, as Omar mentioned, who is notorious for his pro-regime stances and who is also a suspect in the case, Awaidat ordered the release of all the detainees in the case, in the Port case. He charged Bitar with the crime of usurping power, and he issued a travel ban against him. And Awaidat's decision was rightly described as a judicial coup because he has no legal standing and absolutely no jurisdiction to issue such a decision. Facing this situation, Bitar announced the suspension of the investigation indefinitely once again. So today, it's not an exaggeration to say that we are indeed in front of a deadlock, especially that there are lawsuits against Bitar that have not been resolved, and the court that is supposed to resolve them is currently paralyzed. One avenue for reviving the local investigation is to enact the bill proposed by a number of parliamentarians, which requires the amendment of the criminal procedure law, and which would allow Judge Bitar to continue the investigation despite the existence of the request to remove him. However, this requires the parliament to approve the law, and obviously we know the strong grip of the Speaker of the Parliament on the legislative decision-making process. So this is highly unlikely, at least at this stage. There has been calls for international mechanisms and international advocacy. One of them is establishing the UN fact-finding mission, but unfortunately, this would require the political support, especially of our former colonizers, the French, and this support has not been available so far. There has been a positive update past March, where around 38 countries signed a statement at the UN Human Rights Council demanding accountability in the case of the Beirut blast, and condemning the obstruction of the local investigation. So this statement might be an indicator that these countries are willing to push for a fact-finding mission, and this is something that obviously we cannot guarantee, and we should wait for it. And another potential avenue that has been successful in cases involving financial crimes is filing cases abroad. So far, there has been several cases, as you mentioned, by families of the victims that have been filed, whether in London or in the US. And there has been a success in past February, where the Higher Judicial Court of Justice in London found Savaro Limited, which is the chemical company that allegedly purchased the cargo of ammonium nitrate. The court found it liable. But again, this is also limited because it's a civil liability, so they are obliged to pay penalties and damages, but there is no criminal liability. So it's still a limited form of accountability.
And I think the other concern is that we still don't know who the beneficial owner of this company is, and so we don't know actually who's going to be able to pay the victims what that court determined that they were owed. So thank you to Lama and Salma for really laying out how the political elite have such a profound grasp on this judicial system, on its sometimes they use laws and mechanisms and maneuvers that are actually in the law, and sometimes they kind of make up their own, and they kind of toy around with the system apparently as they please, and that paints a very clear picture of the obstruction domestically. I'm going to move to Zaina now, and it was a nice transition, Lama. Thank you for that, because in the absence of domestic accountability, many have turned abroad, and that required a significant effort by the Lebanese diaspora, and you know, which in many ways is a picture of the divisions of Lebanon, but also maybe outside of Lebanon, that people are able to overcome those divisions. So since you were instrumental to a lot of the initiatives that were brought up already in this talk, can you tell us what the diaspora's role was, and the key moments in terms of efforts to unify among the Lebanese diaspora abroad, and what lessons you may have learned about how expatriate communities can organize across these political lines for justice?
Thank you. So we understood very early on that justice will not be served in Lebanon, and so that we needed to be inventive and crafty and seek justice from outside of Lebanon. And there is this saying in French that says that if the door is closed, climb through the window. And this is exactly what we did. The reality of the matter is that neither the US nor Europe wanted to investigate Lebanese dirty money for one good reason, is that Lebanon is a business. And it is actually a very lucrative business, not only for the states themselves, but also for their own politicians at a personal level. It now appears, for example, in the context of the investigation against Riyad Salameh, that the French central bank governor, Christian Noyer, might have received large amounts of cash from his Lebanese counterpart, Riyad Salameh. So it was in no one's interest to open this Lebanese Pandora box. Yet there was just enough separation of power in our democracies. I say our democracies because I am Swiss on them. So this is where it all started. So there was just enough separation of power for the judiciary to function regardless of any political pressure. And that's what happened in the case of Riyad Salameh, for example. We heard that he was protected by the American. We heard that the French wanted him in office no matter what. We also heard that some powers in the Middle East had his back, yet it wasn't enough good a reason not to act. And this is what you call the diaspora was key in changing the rules of the game of impunity. So it wasn't to start with like a concerted initiative, but rather a spontaneous gathering of lawyers and activists and investigative journalists and human rights advocates who wanted to join forces to fight corruption from outside of Lebanon. And that's how it all started. We just met on the road with one common objective, which is fighting impunity in Lebanon, and also being the voice of the voiceless. The fact that we didn't have any skin in the game. Us from outside of Lebanon probably helped tremendously. Neither of us had lost money in the crisis or had any political agenda, or we were not victims of the Beirut Port explosion. We just felt at our personal level that we needed to act, or at least try. And then coming to political pressure, it was a challenge, but it was a positive one because it pushed us to become better at what we were doing. So we had to make sure that each of our cases, all the cases that we filed at the criminal or civil level, were compelling, that each allegation was seriously evidenced, and that we left no stones unturned. We added to that some media pressure to create traction and make sure the words corrupt political elite in Lebanon were present on all minds. And the result is that the European judiciary, the Swiss financial watchdog FINMA, Treasury, and then most recently the European Parliament were somehow left with no other choice but to act, regardless of what the Lebanese judiciary would decide to do or not do, actually. So the role of the diaspora has indeed been key, but please allow me to say that without the work of Omar, Lama, Asad, without all the independent journalists who refused to be bribed to slander us, and it happened so many times over the last 2 years, and without those courageous judges in Lebanon who are standing firm in the face of adversity, and if it wasn't for those who paid with their lives because they refused to be silenced and were assassinated, then we wouldn't have been able to achieve much. So each one of us started planting like one tree in our own little corner, and then another tree, and all of a sudden 2 years later we have this gigantic forest, and which created bridges between us all.
Excellent, thank you, Zaina. And I'd be really interested eventually, I mean, to see how that has worked for other countries as well. I'm not sure if my internet has slowed down or if that's someone else. Let's try. Test. Can everyone hear me? Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I don't know what just happened, but thank you for that. And hopefully I didn't interrupt you, Zaina, as you were talking. So thanks again for that. And again, it would really be interesting to compare how other countries have been able to get their diaspora to kind of, you know, pool efforts outside to be able to see change on the inside as well. I'm going to jump now to Asad. I mean, I know that a lot of people have had, you know, the two issues that we've talked about so far, the main example that they refer to when they talk about the flawed judiciary. But some of the research that you've done recently will really help us see it from a more comprehensive angle. So one of the sets of victims that we don't talk about enough is those who have been accused of a crime in Lebanon, but who are detained without trial. That includes obviously Lebanese, but also non-Lebanese, many Syrians, as I gather, especially in the last couple of years. So can you summarize Gherbal's recent research on this and tell us how it fits into the bigger picture? How does it complement everything else that we've been talking about today?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Maya, and thank you for time up for organizing this. I'm very humbled to be part of this panel discussion, and I would like to thank you for giving us the chance to talk about some of the work we're trying to do in order to combat corruption in Lebanon. So Gherbal was founded in 2018 on the sole purpose of actually working on the access to information law that was passed the year before, because we knew that the government has passed it in the parliament with no objection, and that was very weird for a law that was sitting in the drawers for 9 years before. And then a few months after, when Lebanon went to actually beg for more money in Paris 4, but they wanted to call it nicely, and they call it CEDR, we knew why they passed this law, because it was on the first paper that they said, we did reforms, we just allowed access to information in Lebanon. And then we wanted to test this and see if it actually is going anywhere. And as we expected, it wasn't actually very effective. Unfortunately, after 5 years of the law that has been passed, and although we were very successful in collecting a lot of data based on requests of information that exceeded 1,000 requests over the last 5 years, there is the biggest chunk of the law that is not being applied, where the administrations have to actually publish the data themselves before we go and ask for something that we can't find. The law is significantly progressive for Lebanon. It pushes all the administrations to publish most of the data they have. The general law says they have to publish everything with a few exceptions. And these exceptions, in most of the time, they do have some common sense. But if we actually go now to the websites of these administrations, if they do exist, because after the 2019 financial collapse, there's significant websites, administrations' websites, whether on national or local level, that cease to exist anymore, because they cannot pay for the servers, or they don't have electricity, or they don't even have staff to operate them. And this has become year after year proving to be very difficult in order to first have the data, archive the data, and then publish the data. And then when you publish it, it also needs to be accessible, because as we can see of most of the data sets which are important, such as the state budget, election results, data of BDL, which is the Bank of Lebanon, Central Bank of Lebanon, Ministry of Finance, or whatsoever, they're published in PDF formats, usually in Arabic language, and in a way that is very tricky and very hard and able to understand. So Ghirbal came into the picture in order to, one, collect this data, second, analyze this data, and third, open it up for investigative journalists, activists, concerned citizens, lawyers, and everyone who's very interested in actually having hands-on information that was not available for the public. Now, answering your question, allow me to share your screen, but the host has to allow me to do that. As we actually asked for data about prisoners in Lebanon for the Ministry of Justice, and we were able to have an answer from them a few weeks back. And what we were able to see is in 2023, it was the first year ever where the number of people who are prisoned with no sentence is higher than the people who are already sentenced. If this means anything, this means that judiciary system is not functioning. And as my colleagues Lama and Omar have mentioned before, most of the courts are not working, or they don't have significant power in order to operate. Most of the judges are not showing up to work, and they believe that they're being underpaid. But this does affect the people who are being arrested and not convicted, and who we know even historically have been sitting in prisons for years before they're being properly sentenced. Since I cannot share the screen yet and show that, I will jump to answer one question that was very significantly important in the chat that I saw, which is, it says, if in our opinion, have the international financial institutions played a role either directly or indirectly in enabling Lebanese elites to prolong their role? Well, someone just touched based on this and said that our previous colonizers haven't been helpful in finding a result for the Beirut Port explosion. Zena has also mentioned that the French Central Bank director is also maybe implicit in the covering up of the Central Bank of Lebanon president. I would also like to add a few things about it.
I think this fits into the second question that I was planning on asking you. Is it okay if we're talking about the EU and the US and the UN later on? Is it okay if we add this to that section? Is that all right?
Sure. You just killed my joy. But
Cliffhanger.
Yeah.
This is like when Netflix says, "Do you want to watch the next episode?" That's what I'm doing now.
No
so
worries.
Hopefully everybody will stay tuned and
sure,
we can do that.
Now, yeah, but now that I have,
please do the other part of the presentation, but you have 1 minute to do that.
It's okay. So
Thanks.
Over our website, we have extensive data sets that can be seen, and they can be read in both Arabic and English. One of them, if you click on citizen-based data, is the prisoners. And as you see, this is the number of people who have been convicted in Lebanon or arrested. And you can see for the first time ever, as I mentioned, there are 3,200 arrested people versus 2,600 arrested people men. Same applies for women. So if we dilute these, we can also see for women, the number of arrested 185 versus convicted 73. We can also see what are the top crimes from 2018 to 23, and drug crimes is number 1, and then significantly increasing number is crimes committed against state security. And then we can also see the nationalities of the people who are present this year in 2023. And we can also see a filter where people can filter the data per prison and per year and be able to check all of this information. That's all I have for now, and I will be ready for the next question.
Great, thanks, Asad. So we're going to move into the second round of questions. I'm just going to remind the audience here to continue to post your questions in the chat. I do see there's a couple of them in here, which is great. I'm really happy to see them. I'm going to integrate a couple of them into the next round of questions, and then I think we will open it up to actually ask them more directly. So I'm going to come back to Ahmad. So since we've been so negative so far, and laying out the problems and laying out how everybody is failing in their responsibilities and the crisis has made things worse, I do want to at least take a moment to highlight that there are these individual bright spots in the system that I think it's really worth highlighting. So there are some good guys in the system. Could we see, well, first of all, who are they? Who is doing things right? Is it members of the High Judicial Council? Is it the smaller people that we've never maybe even heard of? Are there clerks that are going to the Justice Palace to get work done because they don't want to be part of the obstruction? What needs to be done to support them if that's the right pathway forward?
Okay. Actually, there's no a singular institution in the judiciary that is doing things right in a whole, but of course there is many separate individual judges that are doing very respectful and impressive work despite the political and economic crisis. Going back to 2018, there's a point that gives some hope to the judiciary system. There was the Lebanese Judges Association was established in 2018, and it is formed from a reform-minded judges that already faced many obstacles to establish like this association, but it is I think it's very positive that there are judges that gathered in an association and they are demanding and advocating for their independence. Moreover, this association was found in all phases in Lebanon that are essential for accountability, like in all what happened in the Beirut Port explosion. They were making they were really the voice of the judiciary, of the independent judiciary, making the right statements, and also, for example, when the parliament want to pass an amnesty law, also this association was making the right work. Of course, as Lama mentioned, there is Judge Tariq Bitar that is working in the Beirut Port explosion with all the pressure, the distrust, the threatening his life. Also, he tried to find many ways to make a precedent and to continue the investigation. Moreover, I would like to mention the public prosecutor at Mount Lebanon, which is Ghada Aoun, that it is she was making what a public prosecutor should make normally, but in Lebanon we don't see a public prosecutor do this. she made prosecutions regarding many corruption cases. Also, she did the prosecution regarding Najib Miati according to the illicit enrichment law. While it's good to say that public prosecutor Ghadaon is politically affiliated, she's not fully independent, and many said that these prosecutions she is making are arbitrary, and she didn't make the balance, the political balance between, and also between sects, etc. But when looking to the cases, case by case, it is very clear that they have proofs and they have serious suspicions in all the prosecutions she made. And the great example for this is the prosecution of Riyad Salemi, and that it also continued before the European judiciary. By the way, at the end, Ghadaon is now dismissed from her work in the judiciary, and she faced an inspection trial inside the judiciary.
How do you think they should be supported? I mean, this is I think a key question for a lot of people, is when they see these restrictions on these judges happening, when they see this happening to Salah al-Bitad, when they see these slew of complaints being filed against any judge who is doing things right, is there anything that can be done? Does it help or does it hurt to have, let's say, international actors, international, other countries jumping in and saying, we support this judge, or we support that judge? I mean, the US has done that on the investigation. Does that help or does it hurt? And is there something else that should be done to more effectively support these judges?
Yes. In general, there are the things that we talked before, like enacting the bill of the independence of judiciary, of course, will help. Like the support, the logistics support that when reforms are coming to, in general, in Lebanon regarding the economic and the financial crisis, this will make courts and judges' work more comfortable. But there is the main idea is when a judge is doing his work and he is facing these campaigns and pressure, is the public solidarity with this judge, not to feel like he is or she is isolated and alone, facing all the political authority and all the regime. Also with the media is, I think, sometimes it will be very very important. And that's what I have. Thank you.
No, I think it's a great point, because when they're siloed off and when they're left to kind of fend off these kinds of complaints, these accusations on their own, I think that's when impunity can basically just do whatever it wants to do, and there's very little attention. And I think one of the things that has really helped in the past couple of years is that regular Lebanese citizens are much more aware of the judiciary as an important pillar of all the rest of the institutions in Lebanon, and so they've become much more conscious of this distortion of justice in Lebanon, which is, I think, overall a positive thing. Just as long as it's not, like many things in Lebanon, it's a war of attrition between the political elite and the public, and the political elite just hopes that everybody gets really tired of what's happening and will just kind of give up and stop talking about it. So as long as people don't give up and stop talking about it, I think that we have a fighting chance in that sense. Zeina, I'll come to you for a question that has come up. These a few different speakers have have brought it up. In terms of international pitfalls on the international scene. So France has been unwilling, as a couple of our speakers have said, to endorse a fact-finding mission into the blast. We understand in some cases, French diplomats and French officials have been unwilling even to meet victims of the Beirut Port blast. When it comes to the international investigations into financial crimes as well. I mean, in some cases we've seen, maybe some slower developments on the UK side of things because they've been taken up by a lot of other investigations. We've seen, obviously, let's say, if Lebanon is unwilling to help with the requests for mutual legal assistance, then does that mean that international investigations are basically, they hit a dead end? How have you managed those challenges when they're actually coming from abroad and not coming from the domestic scene? Mute. You're still on mute, unfortunately. There we go.
There we go, perfect. I just wanted to say that Human Rights Watch published an open letter where it not only denounced France's unwillingness to endorse a fact-finding mission, but they also specifically refer to the obstruction of President Macron himself. He had initially told reporters that an international open and transparent probe was needed before backtracking, and subsequently, in the many meetings that Human Rights Watch had with the French authorities, they had to counter many excuses for inaction, like it's not the right time, this is not a human rights issue, talking about the Beirut Port explosion, that is not a human rights issue, and let's give the domestic investigation a chance. So in any case, if we want to look at the fact-finding mission that Omar Lama have also referred to, then that requires, in any case, a majority of 24 states out of the 47 states sitting. So it's difficult to rally such a big consensus, knowing that there is political obstruction from countries like Russia, Moldova, Jordan, Panama, and the UK, which you just mentioned. They need to vote on that. The most recent investigations shed light on the role purportedly played by entities operating in these countries. So it is difficult to imagine that there would be a UN-backed fact-finding mission. However, here again, in the same way as when we work on dirty money and corruption, this political pressure does not mean that we cannot seek accountability through other means, and in particular, actually, for the blast. So one way to circumvent the paralysis in Lebanon and political pressure in Lebanon and outside of Lebanon, so I'm talking about political pressure by European states and the US, that is to activate the judiciary in these countries, and that's what we did. So there's currently a case pending in Texas against the company which chartered the Roses, where we represent the American victims of the blast. There are also criminal investigations which are open in France and in Germany, and which we don't talk about, but which we will reactivate very soon alongside actually other jurisdictions, other European jurisdictions. There are also activists and journalists who are actively investigating the corruption scheme which surrounded the explosion and led to the explosions. And those findings will be very helpful for the European prosecutors who will be investigating the Beirut Port explosion, because foreign victims, dual citizens, will be filing in those jurisdictions, and we're working on that, just to make sure that we avoid and circumvent that political pressure and the interference in Lebanon. And also what we finally see actually more and more is that there are more people who are ready to blow the whistle and share evidence to support the victims' quest for justice. And that's really new. So all these factors combined will change the rules of the game. The more proceedings we open outside of Lebanon, and the more we limit the interference field in Lebanon and the political interference as well. There is, though I have to say, there is so much that the judiciary can do. It takes time, it takes resources, and it's exhausting. But this is where targeted sanctions against those who are obstructing the investigations of the blast are extremely important. At the end of the day, we all want to see a positive change in behavior in Lebanon and to restore the rule of law. And targeted sanctions against those prosecutors, against corrupt judges, against politicians and businessmen who are paralyzing the investigations in Lebanon will certainly help the victims and speed up their quest for justice.
Thank you, Zaina. And this is my favorite part of a panel, is when I can then go straight to another panelist and say, why do you disagree? So I'm gonna do that now, and just to kind of recap for the audience as well. There was that there have been repeated hints by various actors that they're willing to put sanctions on various Lebanese officials for obstructing either the Beirut Port blast or the election of a president or other investigations. So that's been really interesting to see this year as kind of various actors start to creep closer and closer to this threat for sanctions. So I'm going to jump to Lema actually and to ask what pitfalls, if these actors, if you're going to be addressing these countries and telling them, okay, if you're going to do this, these are the pitfalls that you need to watch out for. And do you have alternative strategies for international advocacy?
Yeah, thank you. Zaina and I actually started this debate a few months ago, so we'll continue it here. I understand, obviously, the perspective behind advocating for targeted sanctions, especially that, as we said, there is an apparent deadlock at this stage. But yes, the call for sanction does carry constraints, especially in a fragile political atmosphere like Lebanon. So to begin with, sanctions are prone to political manipulation due to their very discretionary nature. So we know that sanctions are decided by political entities such as the EU Council and the OFAC, the Office for Foreign Assets Control at the US Treasury Department. And here, unlike judicial processes where a court investigates crimes and looks at the evidence incriminating all those responsible, sanctions lack this obligation, and accordingly, they allow for selective targeting of individuals. And this is not to say that those who are who have been sanctioned so far are not corrupt, but rather to say that there are many corrupt who have so far enjoyed the protection and the immunity of the international community. Riyad Salameh, for instance, who is notoriously known as an American protege in Lebanon, has only faced sanctions this month after years of depleting billions of dollars and becoming the subject of an Interpol pursuit. And if we look at the text actually regulating the imposition of sanctions on Lebanon, we can see how vague the texts are and how prone to manipulation they can be. So, for example, the EU Council regulation of 2021 states that targeted sanctions should be imposed on, and I quote, persons responsible for undermining democracy and the rule of law in Lebanon. The US executive order of 2007, under which Salameh has been recently sanctioned, targets any person undermining Lebanon's democratic processes or institutions, contributing to the breakdown of the rule of law in Lebanon, supporting the reassertion of Syrian control, or otherwise contributing to Syrian interference in Lebanon, or infringing upon or undermining Lebanese sovereignty. And this is an executive order that was enacted in 2007, so right after the withdrawal of Syrian troops. So these are very broad stipulations that can be applicable on the entire political class in Lebanon implicated in corruption and in undermining the rule of law and democracy, etc. But there is absolutely no indication at this stage that the international community is willing to impose sanctions on the entirety of the political class. But quite the contrary, they have been complicit for many years in maintaining the status quo in Lebanon and in fueling this regime, whether through political support or through the unconditional international aid that has been channeled to Lebanon. And I mean, if we look back in the recent years, right after the August 4th blast, French President Emmanuel Macron came to Lebanon and gave a new lifeline to the regime while people were still in the streets, while people were still mounting the symbolic gallows in the street and demanding for the toppling of the regime. So I don't think there's currently a willingness of the international community to shake the status quo in the country. And that's why I personally have valid concerns that the sanctions might be employed not to serve Lebanon's interests, but rather to serve foreign agendas. And let's be clear, neither the US nor the EU is denying this. So if you look at the decisions governing the sanctions, both documents, the EU document and the US document, explicitly state that the imposition of targeted sanctions will pursue foreign and security policy objectives of the respective countries. So they are telling us we're pursuing our interests and we're pursuing our objectives. And another issue is the use of such sanctions as a tool to pressure local political actors to comply with foreign agendas. And let me just go back to the question, to the issue of the Beirut Port blast investigation. One of the key reasons why Ghassan Awaidad, the public prosecutor, released all the detainees in January 2023 was not only to challenge Tariq al-Bitar, but also because there has been pressure by the American ambassador in Lebanon, Dorothy Shia, who threatened the general prosecutor and the head of the Judicial Council with sanctions in case they did not release Ziad Al-Auf, who is a Lebanese American citizen who was detained in the case for his responsibility as the head of security and safety at the port. Obviously, we don't know the content of the case and his direct responsibility, but I mean, the head of security and safety must have something to do with the port explosion. So, and obviously there are many examples in the recent history of Lebanon. If you go back to even the issue of the deal to demarcate the maritime borders with Israel, we've also heard how Lebanese politicians were coerced into a deal with Israel under threats of sanctions. So this is only to say that sanctions can become tools of neocolonialism to impose foreign agendas and to advance foreign interests. And one last thing to note as well, and I'll say it really quickly, is the economic repercussions of sanctions. So we have learned from experiences in other countries that even targeted sanctions will have repercussions on the economy. If we look at Cuba, Iraq, Syria, Zimbabwe, all of these countries have had cases of targeted sanctions that actually impacted the national economy. And this is because sanctions, especially American sanctions, impose obligations on the private sector. So the private sector will be discouraged from conducting business with a country where there are a significant risk of engaging with individuals who are subject to sanctions. So I think there's also beyond the political argument, there's also an economic argument on the impact of such sanctions on a country that is already battling with an economic crisis.
Thank you, Nama. And this is a debate that extends so much beyond, beyond Lebanon. It's one that I think in the region and globally is one of the most profound debates on these issues. Azad, great. I'm actually going to move to you next. So if you want to comment on that, I'm also going to just ask you straightforwardly the questions that I wanted to ask you as well, and to wrap the question from Mauricio in the chat into this. So I'm going to speak for like an hour. It's going to feel like that, but there's a lot of stuff in there for you. So the EU, the US, the UN, and other aid agencies have tried to address many of the structural challenges in Lebanon, especially during the crisis in the past 4 years, by basically just throwing money at the problem. Obviously, before the crisis and also kind of in the crisis. How do we know that this has not worked? And I mean, we're going to get into how this is looped in, how this is tied into accountability. How do we know this has not worked? What kind of accountability and monitoring work has Gharbal been doing on this in particular? And this is important, what are your 2 policy recommendations? Actually, I'm going to loop in Mauricio's questions first, because he also asked about IFIs. So I mentioned, the EU, the US, UN, etc. But what about the World Bank? What about the IMF? What about the EBRD? What about other IFIs that may have played a role either directly or indirectly in enabling Lebanese elites to prolong their rule? And if you have time at the end, I know I'm now the one rambling, but if you have time at the end to give us at least 1 or 2 policy recommendations on how you would improve the efficacy of such international support. With that, wow. Good luck.
Thanks. Okay, first of all, I want to say I completely agree with what Lama said. I couldn't put it in the best way. All the talk about the foreign aid to Lebanon and how much it's conditioned and how much it serves the agenda of those countries is something that we should never disregard. No nation in the world wants to come help, whether Lebanon or any other country, because they just woke up from their colonization history and they regret what they've done to us as third world countries or sub-Saharan African, Arab, Asian countries or Latin American countries. It's a utopic dream. It's not going to happen. So let's face it. And when we want to talk about things, I love to talk in the form of numbers. Lebanon has received over the past year, since 1990 till 2020, billions and billions of dollars, whether in loans or grants. If they come in grants, it's a small problem. It's still a problem, but it's still a small problem because I, as a taxpayer, don't have to pay it back. I do know it's a one way or another to benefit the people who are the elite by whether they're spending this money on projects owned by which companies are doing owned by people who are in their entourage. But when it is loans, it's double problem because one, I have to pay it as a taxpayer with interest. And you all remember that Lebanon was gonna fail financially starting 2010. And the international community came and said, no, we will save you. And they did Paris 1, Paris 2, and Paris 3. Does anyone know what that happened? It was $2-3 billion extra in debt given to a state that is failing with the knowledge of the IMF, the international community, the World Bank, and everyone. And they still honored Riyad Salami as the best central governor in the world. They did this in compliance. And then suddenly, when the system failed, the same institutions went out to write report and call what happened in Lebanon as a Ponzi scheme. Well, it's an amazing report. You missed one paragraph. It happened with our knowledge, and we contributed to it. I'm going to talk in numbers and share the screen again to show you this. We went through the National Gazette of Lebanon in order to check how much loans and grants were passed as laws by the parliament or decrees by the government. We were able to collect, and these are not my numbers. Each article here shows a document. If you click on the document, you will actually find the actual law or the actual decree. These are 723 documents that show $15 billion of loans and grants. More than 80% of this number is loans and not grants. And if we want to dig further, we discovered that much more of this amount has been given to different entities, whether local entities or national entities, or even bigger entities in the Lebanese state that were not even published in the National Gazette, which is a violation of the law. In the beginning, we were skeptical about this finding until the Court of Audit actually issued a report 6 months ago saying that only 8% of grants were actually reported in a sane way legally. 8% of grants. They haven't released their report on loans yet, but I don't think it's going to be better. If you look at these numbers and you filter them, and you can filter them by the donor, by the grantee, and by keywords, by the year and the amounts, you will be able to, for example, if you just type down Litani, which is the biggest river, longest river in Lebanon, you will see that all of this money came to Litani. That's $500 million. What is so funny is cleaning the Litani Basin area received 4 different loans and grants. The reason was to clean it. They wanted to clean it in the 1996, then 2000, then 2005, then 2012, and millions of dollars were spent. Where is the due diligence that was being done? Why didn't any donor or loan giver actually went and check if actual money was dispersed there before? No homework was done. Where is actually their commitment to their taxpayers, if in the case of the grant? I remember back in 2015, when we were doing the Houston campaign, trying to combat the corruption and the garbage crisis, where all the garbage was filling every place. We discovered that the EU spent 38 million euros on 11 recycling plants. We actually were rented a bus and we went through most of these facilities to see if they're actually operational. Back then, none was. Some of them, the actual gadgets that were costing millions of dollars to be in place, were sold as junk 2 years after the opening. So nobody cared about it. And when we raised this voice inside the EU back then, we were sanctioned from being invited to EU meetings for years. So the corruption in Lebanon is epidemic. And to be honest, it's not only the political class. We have people who claim that they're fighting the system and they are change makers, and NGOs and whatever, they're also part of the corruption, whether we like it or not. There are good people in public offices and bad people. There are good people who are changes and bad people. There are good citizens and bad citizens. The only issue is that the bad ones are the ones who are ruling us, and the bad ones who are the ones who are actually helping each other to stay afloat and be able to benefit of the system that doesn't take accountability into consideration. The problem in Lebanon is corruption has been systemically embedded within the fabrics of the society that it's so hard to get out of it. But there are solutions. We're not the first country in the world to invent the wheel. If we actually make some procedures in order to follow the money, the tracks of the money, and actually know who's getting paid what, and actually have a good system of judiciary and a good system of taxation, which is just taxation and not flat fees like we have now in Lebanon. And we actually have a functioning similar IRS system that we can actually follow up on where did this fortune come from. Like, it's crazy that most of us, we live in villages or cities, and we know people who work for the state, and we know if they're working for a municipality or working as for a small public entity, their salary is $1,000 to $2,000 tops, and this is before the financial collapse. So how come they have 10 lands? How come they have a palace? How come they are able to afford a vacation in Nice on yearly basis? These things are mind-blowing. If I want to add into numbers, I will share the screen one more, and I will show you this other data set. This is the data that we asked some of the administrations last year to give us, which is a list of the number of contracts they signed with different contractors. We asked for this list from 210 different entities on national level. And we asked them to give us the data for 20 years, from 2000 till 2020. Only 44 administrations replied. Not all of them gave us the 20 years. And only from looking at those numbers, we were able to check 18,000 contracts from 3,600 contractors for a value which is $13.5 billion. And you will be amazed on the projects you discover the money was spent on. So I will take into consideration one example, which is the Office of the Minister of State for Administrative Reform, because here we are talking about some money that is being spent to make some reform, right? And you can go down to the list and enjoy the data. There have been millions of dollars that were spent. For example, I'll pick some. I'm sorry, there is a lot of gunfire next to me, so I'm a bit tense now, but I'll try to continue. So for example, أهداف تنموية في 3 مناطق لبنانية. Like, this is very broad. It says they're doing developing projects in 3 different areas, $240,000. This one, training on information technology and communication in different public entities, $1 million almost. This one is amazing. معايير الموقع الإلكتروني للحكومة اللبنانية. Like, they're putting standards for websites for public administrations, $150,000. We don't even have the websites going on. And you can imagine the amounts that were spent. This is only $150 million on administrative reform. So you can imagine how much the corrupt, and who paid for this? It was in forms of loans and grants where those donors should have done their homework right, and at least monitoring and evaluation, at least a report that you say, oh, there was a scandal here. It was our money and it went to waste. But we didn't see this. So I'm gonna stop there, and I hope that I answered all the package question that came at me in the beginning.
There were a lot, Asad, thank you. No, but I think what you're doing, I think that the really important role that you're playing on this panel as well is to really broaden the way that we're thinking about impunity, not just to think about these 2 issues only, but to think about the lack of accountability that is, as you said, it is endemic to the Lebanese system. And if we don't think about all of the ways in which there's a lack of accountability in terms of funding and in terms of, prisoners that are not getting due process as well, if we're not thinking about those things as well, then we have a lot of blind spots. So I think it's much, it's really appreciated. So I'm going to move into the Q&A section now. We've got some really, really great questions that have come in from the audience, and I'm trying to, I'll try to kind of distribute them now. I have one bulk Frankenstein question that is a combination of different questions that I'm going to give. I'm just going to throw it to all of you, and you're going to address it basically in your comments if you'd like. And then I also have a couple of questions that I'm going to distribute specifically to specific people. So and then I'll give you each basically, I think at this point, quick math, 4 minutes to respond and to conclude, to conclude in the way that you would like to conclude. So here we go. So the big Frankenstein question, it's a combination of the questions that I've seen come in from Karim Shayib, from Angus Blair, and then one anonymous question as well. So to read out Karim's comments first, it's clear that persistent efforts from civil society, both in Lebanon and the diaspora, have made a difference, whether it's the international probe and sanctions related to Saleme or in the port blast. But at the end of the day, Lebanon's ruling elite still own the judicial, political, and security institutions, and Lebanon remains a haven for criminals. Riyad Saleme, despite Interpol notices, sanctions, leaked forensic audits, is safe in Lebanon, even if he is convicted locally as opposed to internationally. So how do we break that barrier? Is it a matter, given that, impunity still reigns, is it just a matter of more of what is being done now that will eventually pile up international pressure and continue this domino effect? Or is there something more local, like extreme political change from the bottom up, that becomes necessary? I'm going to add to that the questions that were posed by Angus and by one of the anonymous posters. Can the state's institutions be transformed to be neutral and beneficial for all in Lebanon? How likely is that transformation rather than hypothetical change? And I think a very interesting question, what would motivate different elite groups to make a genuine effort to reform the legal system? Is there a way to incentivize that for them? So basically, does international pressure eventually lead to a domino effect? Can state institutions be transformed, genuinely transformed? And is there a way to incentivize that political change for the political actors that hold those institutions? So these are things that you each can think about. And then I have specific questions to distribute. To Lama, a question from an anonymous poster. What role does Hezbollah play in the obstruction of justice, the elephant in the room that we haven't yet talked about? And how deep is Hezbollah's grip on the judiciary? An additional question that, again, brings in another important perspective from Shelly Bayag, who identifies herself as one of the people who have had their cases stalled in Lebanon as a result of the corrupt judicial system. Shelly is non-Lebanese. Her children were abducted, were taken to Lebanon from Canada in 2018 by their father, and she's not seen any progress in her case. So her question is, what can be done to improve the rule of law for family issues in Lebanon? So I'll give those to you. I'm going to now address then sets of questions from Nadim Mata, both to Zaina and to Asad. What are you doing to support the judges who are still trying to make a difference? Are you coordinating with them? Are you equipping them with what they need to create some sense of accountability, even in the small corruption cases? And another one, which is an interesting one, if Riyad Salim is the tip of the iceberg for accountability in Lebanon, is there a next layer of high-level figures with a bullseye on their backs as far as prosecutions in jurisdictions outside of Lebanon? So I'm going to open it up to whoever wants to take a stab at this monster set of questions first. And I am seeing questions continue to roll in, which is tricky, but we're going to try to address what we've gotten so far. Zaina, do you want to take a stab at those?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with the last question of Nadim. Riyad Salameh was indicted for conspiracy and association de malfaiteurs, as Aude Burezi said, the judge in France, which is a criminal association. The Swiss prosecutor here, sorry, my phone is beeping. The Swiss prosecutor also is investigating aggravated money laundering, and he believes that there is a professional system behind Riyad Salameh, which is laundering money. So indeed, we are not talking about Riyad Salameh alone, and it's a system. No, we're fighting a system here, and it is indeed the tip of the iceberg. What will make a change is to keep on investigating, is to extend the investigation to other corrupt officials. We have seen that there are now links to Miati, both in the Swiss, in the Liechtenstein, in the Luxembourg investigation. We have seen links to bankers in Lebanon, to enablers, to Bank Audi, to Bank Med, who their names are now in the European files, in the hands of the European prosecutors. So it is indeed an entire system, and it is we need just to pull the first thread, and then it's like that Pandora box that we often refer to. So it's not just Riyad Salameh, right? It's a conspiracy. It's an association of criminals here. So we can't just stop with Riyad Salameh. And regarding your question about how we support the judiciary in Lebanon, well, our action at my level, but Maya, you directed the question to me. So at our level, at Accountability Now, we represent victims outside of Lebanon to circumvent the muzzling of the Lebanese judiciary. We are not yet, although we would love that, but so many on this panel are working on it, supporting like Lebanese judges.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Zaina. Lama, do you want to take a stab at some of the questions that have come up and any concluding comments that you might have?
Sure. So let me first answer, see the name, sorry, Shelley's question on family law in Lebanon. I'm really sorry you had to go through this, but unfortunately, your case is very common. And it's also actually a reminder that when we're talking about impunity and accountability, we're not only talking about the major tragic events in the country, but we're also talking about the very mundane, everyday cases that every citizen and every resident in Lebanon faces. So when it comes to family law in Lebanon, one of the main challenges, as we know it, is that first, we don't have one family law, we have 15 laws. So every religious group has its own set of laws and its own set of courts. And religious courts have held a monopoly over family law. And obviously, sectarian leaders have also maintained this monopoly by refusing and resisting the enactment of a unified civil personal status law. And so a citizen does not have the option to exit the sectarian system, but our relationship with the state is often mediated through our religious groups. So this is the first issue. Another issue is that religious courts have also enjoyed a certain immunity over the years, although although legally the state does hold a role and a responsibility in overseeing religious courts and ensuring that they are complying with the public order, including human rights standards, the state has so far adopted a laissez-faire approach towards religious groups and a very prudent approach of non-interference. So the control of the state vis-a-vis religious communities and religious courts has been very timid. And as we talk about the independence of the judiciary and the civil court system, we need to also address the independence of the judiciary in religious courts. So all of these issues render that we do not have a unified family law system. We do not have independent courts to look into family law issues. And obviously, this is on top of all the discrimination that women face, children face in these courts. So this is briefly on family law. I think there was another question on, what was it? Yeah, on the role of Hezbollah. First, it's important to note that there are no suspects that are officially affiliated with Hezbollah. So there is none of the suspects so far that have been summoned to court are members of Hezbollah. But the party has been very vocal in defending their allies, including the pro-Amal ministers and pro-Islamiyya Frangiya Minister Youssef Finianos. And this has been through a systematic attempt to discredit Judge Bitar and the really systematic character assassination of Judge Bitar and threats against him. And all these threats culminated in the violence that we've seen in the Tayouni events, which was basically a one-day mini civil war that erupted in front of the Palace of Justice in Beirut. And there has been, obviously, we've all heard of the news of Wafi Safa, who is the chargé of Hezbollah's liaison and coordination unit, directly threatening to forcibly remove Tariq al-Bitar. The words he used, Naqba Tariq al-Bitar. So there has been direct threats by Hezbollah in this case. But I feel compelled also to add just two more things. First, Hezbollah is not the only entity responsible for obstructing the Beirut Port blast investigation. I just mentioned the case where the US ambassador actually succeeded in releasing one of the main detainees and one of the main suspects in the case, and this was not Hezbollah. Another thing that is very important to remember is that the obstruction in the Beirut blast investigation, as I started by saying, is not exceptional, but it's symptomatic of the broader flaws in the Lebanese judiciary. And these flaws were not born today. These flaws have been characterizing the post-war era in Lebanon. And all political parties have been directly implicated in maintaining this. All political parties, and I mean here all post-war sectarian parties, have been implicated in weakening the judiciary and weakening the rule of law in Lebanon and the independence of the judiciary. Omar talked about how public prosecutors are appointed on the basis of on a sectarian basis. And we remember in the last appointment of judges, how every political party, every sectarian leader actually had their own list of judges who they wanted to appoint. So it's really ridiculous at this stage. Obviously, I understand the frustration with Hezbollah's involvement, but when we're really giving a diagnosis of the issue of the independence of the judiciary, it's important to remember that yes, Hezbollah did play a violent role at this stage, but not to absolve the responsibility of all other actors who have been fighting the judiciary and who have stopped the independence of the judiciary for the last 30 years.
Thank you, Lama. That was a really impressive summary for all those questions. So I'm going to turn now to Asad for the last comments, since Omar has endorsed Lama's comments. So we're not going to turn to him. So we'll turn to Asad for the closing comments. You have 4 minutes if possible, and then I'll hand it over to Audrey. Go ahead.
Thank you, Maya. So first of all, I'm going to say that I agree with Lama. Hezbollah is a byproduct of the Lebanese system. If nowadays Hezbollah controls the state because of its arms, but in the 70s it was the Christian militias Some other time, it will be other militias and other sectarian group. The issue is with the system itself. It's a sectarian system that is designed in the 1800s that is still being applied in 2023. Wake up, people. You cannot run a country in this way. End of story. Now, going back to the questions, yes, we do actually in Ghirbal open our offices and our data for everyone, whether it's judges, investigative journalists, other CSOs, concerned citizens, and a lot of activists. We actually conduct workshops and town hall meetings all over Lebanon to talk about our work. And we don't only work on access to information, we also work on illicit enrichment, public procurement, and whistleblowers laws. And these are all the reform laws that Lebanon is using, the Lebanese government is using to sell their ability to do reforms for the international community in order to beg for more money on our own expenses. What we do is we monitor the actual implementation of these laws, and we prove day after day that they're not actually happening. So yes, we do communicate with a lot of those stakeholders. It's not a secret that one of the biggest investigative journalism show run by Riyad Qubaisi has a big collaboration with Ghirbal in providing the data for some of the show segments. But we also think that he does an amazing job on his own without our work as well. And we also work with a lot of groups in order to use this data in order to file corruption cases. But to be honest and complete transparent, we have a lot of work to do in getting the data, analyzing it, and publishing it. We can do the whole work by ourselves. If other people who want to change the system and who are activists, who are lawyers, who are change groups, don't pick up on the work we do and actually take the torch the extra mile, we can't really do anything. We cannot be the prosecutors ourselves. We don't have the legal expertise to file cases. We don't own the air and the media to show the data we have. And unfortunately, although we try our best and we try our maximum to do the communication properly, we still have a lot of gaps. And in the end of the day, we are a small organization. If I tell you the budget, which I will, which is less than $1 million for the last 6 years, including taxpayers, contribution for the national security, 7 staff, renting an office, we literally have less money than a small municipality in Lebanon, but yet we do this work. And I know by facts and by numbers that we know a lot of other organizations that have got significantly 10 to 100 folds more money than we did. And in their mandate and in their proposals, sometimes they use our name as a source of data. But we don't see them knocking our doors to collaborate. Because as I mentioned before, corruption is systemic in this country. It's not only the people who are power and the elite. It's also sometimes the people who are demonstrating next to you.
As I mentioned in the chat, it's time to wrap up, but I want to really sincerely thank Omar, Lama, Asad, and Zaina. You've been excellent panelists in this extremely timely conversation at such a critical time. Thank you so much to our moderator, Maya, for guiding the conversation so well as well. I just want to share this conversation as part of a larger body of work on and commitment to Lebanon by Time Up, including on the independence of the judiciary, accountability for myriad crimes, the economic and political crises, civil society, and so much more. So I really invite you to explore our work on timeup.org and to follow Time Up, as well as these excellent panelists who you've heard speak today. We work with all of them and will continue to do so as long as there are problems like these to address. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us and to the entire team that made this event possible. Have a wonderful day, everyone.